My previous job was at Blackpool Zoo for 9 years, which I was also involved in education. And through those two zoos, what I'm going to try and do is talk to you about some of the ideas I have about zoos' roles within sustainability. They are very varied, but from reading about different ideas, I think that zoos' roles are about connecting people. So we could talk about this building, we could talk about the kind of infrastructure of the zoo. The zoo's been here for hundreds of years, and if we really looked at the kind of the building side of it, I'm sure Trudy would probably say it's not very sustainable. We have the first concrete pour building here, which is the penguin pool. We can't knock it down because it's architecturally significant. So when you walk around at lunchtime, you'll notice that some of the buildings are not very sustainable but have other importance. So from an education point of view, I think we can tackle it in a completely different way. So the three things I'm going to talk to you today is about connecting people to nature, so making those emotional connections, also raising awareness of global issues, and then lastly, demonstrate to people how to take positive action. So firstly, to connect people to nature, I'm sure you all remember the first time you were connected to animals, connected to nature when you were a child. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. I certainly can remember when I was about 3 or 4, me and my sister in the garden, playing with worms, making like the worm palace and having a great time, and probably had a very similar childhood to Trudy. But I don't think it stops as you go on. I was at a conference in Antwerp on Monday, Tuesday, and I saw an echidna for the first time in real life. It's a bit like a hedgehog from Australia. I also saw an eastern lowland gorilla, only 2 in captivity at the moment. So all the gorillas in zoos are western lowland gorillas, and this was the first time I'd seen that. And so for me, that's a significant connection to my life and connecting people to nature. So what do zoos do? Well, we have millions of people come to London Zoo and Whipsnade Zoo, so 1.7 million every year. We have 140,000 children come on education visits over the 2 sites. 24 million people visit zoos every single year. So that's more people visiting zoos than go to football matches. So we have a really, really big audience to talk to. We also have a really broad audience to talk to. So there isn't really a typical visitor. We have people who come with their families. We have people who really want to see an echidna for the first time. We have people who are just there to explore. They may be a tourist in London, and they just want to see what London Zoo is all about. So we have lots and lots of different people that we need to connect to for lots of different reasons. And these are some of the ways that London Zoo will connect to people. And you'll notice that all of them are real life experiences. So they are kind of multi-sensory. They're connecting to butterflies and stick insects and meerkats and zebras, and it means that we can have a lot of opportunities to talk to people about how fantastic animals are. And I think that should be the first thing that zoos do, is say, this is why we're here, and to connect people to nature. Because a lot of the time when we talk about sustainability, a lot of it is about preaching to people, about telling them what not to do. But I think we need to go a step back and say, well, first of all, let's connect people to this wonderful world that we're in. Because if you say, save the orangutans, save the tigers, people might say, I don't know where orangutans are from. We've got a new tiger exhibit that's going to be built in a couple of years' time. And one of the first questions we're going to ask, do you know where tigers live? Do you know what a tiger is? Because certainly in Blackpool, I had people coming up to me saying, can you explain to me what this lion is doing? And it was a tiger. So if you're starting with people who don't know the difference between lions and tigers, how are you going to be talking about climate change to them? How are you going to be talking about these really difficult issues? So I think our job, first of all, is to connect people to nature. And what better way to connect people? I took this yesterday. This is a baby elephant that was born on Tuesday night. So, see, I've got a nice R in there. And this is what sells zoos. And whether you like zoos or not, whether you agree with animals in captivity, these moments, these opportunities for people to connect. I was there at lunchtime, and there was 2 classes, and they were quiet, they were looking, they were taking pictures, they were talking about what would it be like to be a baby elephant. 20 stone of elephant there. And it means that people will go home and remember that as their day out. They might remember the train and the ice lollies, but hopefully they'll also remember those connections to real, vivid nature. But how do we talk about nature? Because when we talk about kind of what's going on in the world, Most of the time we may talk about the top picture. So if we looked at that, we might say, well, what's going on? You've got a tiger, we don't know whether it's alive or dead, we don't know how the people are in that picture, has it attacked their village? A lot of the time when we show images of endangered species, of the world today, we often use this very negative side of nature. And a bit like if you've got a negative picture on the news or a negative picture in a magazine, often people turn off straight away. So something that I'm really interested in is saying, well, should we be connecting to them positively? Should we say, well, this is how fantastic animals are, using a more positive picture, and then start to talk about different issues? We don't want to turn people off to nature and sustainable issues, we want to turn people on. The next slide, this is a very famous picture that we used in 2002. It was a bushmeat campaign that was out throughout the European Zoo Association, and you'd find the top picture in many, many zoos. And there was a lot of issues about whether it was okay to show this to families, would people walk away, what was their reaction? And so something that I think is really interesting is for sustainable issues, should we be talking about how tragic the world is and what's it going to be like in the next 50 years? One of the strangest things I've ever seen is at an aquarium, there was a colouring in sheet for children, and it had a line to show where the water was going to rise in the next 50 years. So in that child's lifetime, they're colouring in where they're living, and they know it's going to be underwater, according to this aquarium, which I think is a very sort of dark, doomy image to be thinking about. Well, should we be kind of connecting them more positively using images like this? And I think this is a good discussion point to say, well, should we be talking about positive action or negative action? The second role that I think, once we've connected them to nature, is to talk about raising awareness of global issues. Something that I'm interested in at the moment is conservation marketing or social marketing. It had its foundations in health and social care. So the idea that if you think about smoking or kind of eating more fruit and vegetables, the idea was to look at the barriers and look at the benefits and trying to kind of sell that idea to people, saying if you stop smoking, these things will happen. Now, if you stop smoking, after a week you feel better, you've got more money in your pocket, and after a year you're going to have health benefits. If you start recycling bottles, what is going to happen to you individually? And individually, we all might recycle and we might feel better about that, but we are in a really small percentage. The rest of the world's population doesn't think like that. An interesting document by a company called Futera is called Branding Biodiversity, and it talks about the people who are writing information about sustainability are in a small minority. They think that by recycling it means that everybody else will have the same ideas, saying if I recycle or if I turn my lights off, then I feel morally good and therefore everybody else will follow my behaviour. Well, it doesn't work like that. So we need to say, well, how do we look at different audiences and try and make it more accessible for them to think about? If we think about climate change, it's a very complex issue. So zoos' roles in that is to try to say, okay, well, how can we connect it to something you know? So if we've engaged them, we've connected them with nature. So let's think about penguins, our new penguin beach enclosure. We've connected them with penguins, and as they navigate around the enclosure, they get to the research hut. They meet Tom. I mean, it's a cutout of Tom, it's not really Tom. Tom is a penguinologist, and he's working looking at climate change and how it affects penguins. So immediately you've connected people to an animal, to an issue, and you've allowed people to make sensible decisions. I think that if the general zoo visitor that we have often gets completely confused by what we're trying to tell them. And I think we need to think about our messages much more closely, much more focused to make sure that we know what we're trying to tell people to do. If we're talking about deforestation, you were talking about your joiners not knowing where wood had come from. I think it's very true. I think if you talk to people about kind of where things come from, we have lots of stories about people having sort of like grow your own initiatives, and they're digging carrots and they give them to the kids to take home. And the kids will say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not eating that. That comes from the ground. And yet they eat it every day. Or even adults sort of saying, well, what are you doing? Oh, we're digging potatoes. But why are those potatoes in the ground? So I think, again, we've got to think about, we sat here may think, well, the world knows what's going on. They know the kind of tensions with deforestation. But to an average person, there's a lot of things, a lot of basics we need to kind of fill in before we start talking about these difficult issues. And I think zoos, with their big audiences, their big demographics, are really well placed to start talking about those ideas. As well as the 2 zoos, we also have the conservation programs. They have the Institute of Zoology. We have conservation projects in 50 countries. We have lots of research scientists doing lots and lots of really, really good work. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in our department is trying to disseminate that information into a way that our general public can understand the amazing work that those conservationists, those scientists are doing at ZSL. The last thing I want to say is how to demonstrate positive action. I always remember it was all about act now. Climate change is here, act now. And I was like, how? How can we act now? Do you want me to start dancing around? I think that when we ask people to do things, again, we've got to be really clear. If we want people to save energy, how do you want them to save energy? If you want to, say, insulate your house, well, is that the ceiling? Is that the walls? Is that, you know, the windows? Again, we're assuming that people have too much information about, they know what we want them to do. And I think when we look at things like social marketing and conservation marketing, it basically says, do not be too vague, do not be too woolly. Make sure your messages are really vivid and concrete and audience specific. And that's something in zoos we've got to say, okay, if we're thinking about turning lights off when you leave the house, who are we directing that to? We need to contextualise that into people's lives. We need to say, well, okay, if we're thinking about water, again at Antwerp Zoo, they have a really kind of fun game about water use. And it's 2 teams that are kind of pitted against each other. And every time you get a question wrong, it shows you how much water you've wasted during that activity. So we might say, well, how much water would be wasted if you left the tap running for 5 minutes? And they say, what are the answers? And if you get it wrong, it actually shows you. That's clear, demonstrable action to say that people go, I understand, I'm looking at an amount of water that is wasted, not saying, you're wasting water by leaving the tap on. That's such a vague statement that most people are going to say, okay, well, I'll turn it off, or I might turn it on, or I might turn it off. But certainly it's something that we've got to think about. Now, just a few examples from the zoo world. Palm oil is an interesting topic to think about. Again, you might go to the supermarket and you might choose products without palm oil in. It's in 1 in 4 food products at the moment. And something that zoos are trying to do is make people aware of the problems that palm oil can cause. It's a monoculture. If you think about orangutans, a lot of it is grown in sort of Borneo, and they're chopping down primary rainforest, putting these kind of palm oil plantations in there, and so there's a lot of biodiversity loss. And this is a really interesting thing because palm oil is used in biofuel. So can we be sustainable and can we save biodiversity? If we're thinking about nuclear power plants, you know, there is that tension between biodiversity and sustainability. So Zoos Victoria and Taronga and a lot of the Australian zoos decided to say, okay, what we're going to do is look at palm oil and try and raise awareness, try and give people action. And what they've done in Australia is made all the products that are Australian, so about 20 different products now. It's just a new sort of initiative. Say whether they have palm oil and where it comes from, whether it's a sustainable palm oil. Just very quickly, something that ZSL has worked on in the last year is Project Ocean. And a lot of the sustainability work that we do is often with partners. So we've got the zoo, and we've also got Selfridges, which is a big department store. And they had 3 objectives. Raise awareness of overfishing, change people's buying and eating habits, and raise money and awareness for marine reserves. So clear, smart objectives. And what they did was from September 2010 through to June. June was the kind of key month where Project Ocean was launched at Selfridges, and they had a large marketing campaign. So this is the front of Selfridges. You've got jellyfish around the store. There's a picture of Prince Charles interacting with a balloon jellyfish, which I think is brilliant. They had displays of what the coral reef looks like in many of the Australian areas at the moment. They also had some fun, because certainly with all of the sustainable activities, we've got to make sure that people say, oh yeah, I remember riding on the whale rodeo